Hello, everybody, and welcome back. I'm Diane Pohl-Heller from Sounds True Studio in Boulder, Colorado, and welcoming you yet again to Psychotherapy Training Summit 2.0. And we are going to be, of course, looking at leading-edge discoveries and teachings on neuroscience, trauma, mindfulness, attachment, and relationships all across the board. And we've got these whole 14 days to really hear from experts in these various fields, each for about 90 minutes or a little bit more. And at the end, we always have Q&A, so please write in your questions. We'd love to hear from you. Tonight, I'm honored to have a chance to discuss and hear from Joni Borisenko along with you. And Joan will be on the phone with us tonight. And we also just want to mention it's the fifth day of our program so far. We've had the first night we had Rick Hansen, did a great job on neuroplasticity, positive neuroplasticity, and how we can install that in the brain. Second night we had Ellen Bader with how we as therapists and clinicians can work with couples around the issues of lying and how we can also use confrontation. Third night we had Sue Johnson on EFT, emotionally focused therapy, and the research to support it. Great talk. Last night Stephen Porges on the neurophysiology of threat and also social engagement. And more, if you want to know more on polyvagal theory, just go to his website, stephenporges.com. If you want to catch up or find out what's coming up ahead, just go to psychotherapysummit.com, or you can get that same information if you hit the upgrade button on your screen. I love hearing all these experts, and I'm learning a lot myself, so this has been great, and it's fun to the challenge of synthesizing and integrating these wonderful perspectives. And it's great because each are teaching us all sorts of new information, along with really what I love the most, the innovative clinical applications that hopefully we can use right away, the ones that fit for us. We all want to serve our clients better, and this is a great way to get some of the cutting-edge tips, what's going on in the field. So thank you for taking your time to join us. I know you've got a lot going on, and it's challenging with all the different demands. So we're really glad you're with us tonight. As you know, everybody is sharing their training, and they're also providing bonus gifts for those that choose to do the upgrade package, so you're welcome to consider that if it fits for you. And remember that the first 24 hours are free, so if you want to just review things or have a little more time to go over it, you have that opportunity. We have 20 hours of training material, 21 CE credits are approved, and during the summit all the way through October 1st, you also get a $200 discount if you choose to decide that the upgrade package works for you, to have all of this information downloaded, and you can own it and have it in your own personal library. So I'm really excited to introduce Joan. She's a Harvard Medical School trained cell biologist and psychologist. She's written 15 books, including Pocket Full of Miracles and Fire in the Soul, as inspiration for trauma survivors and also all of us. And three of her books are really relevant for tonight's discussion, so I want to highlight those. The Plant Plus Diet Solution on Nutrition is a really important piece of what she's going to talk about tonight because of its integration with epigenetics and gut microbes and how they affect us and also treatment. And also her best-selling book, Minding the Body, Mending the Mind, that she wrote in 1987 has upgraded over the years and still popular today, as she's really a pioneer and expert in mind-body medicine and one of the people to kick it off way back when. So we have really happy to have a chance to dive into her wisdom tonight. And the other book that's relevant for this evening's talk, and you'll get all these additional information in your bonus packages from her about these topics, is It's Not the End of the World. It's a smaller book on how to develop resilience in times of change. Certainly that's relevant for us every day at this point. She's a pioneer in the synthesis of science, psychology, and the spiritual dimensions of life. Her website's joanborisenko.com for more information. And I've personally known Joan and have been watching her and reading her books for a long time. And we've met at several conferences and had some good sit-down chats on trauma, healing, and spirituality. Joan is truly a Renaissance woman. So I'm going to kick it over to Joan, and she's going to dive deep with us. And welcome, Joan Borisenko.
Thank you so much, Diane. I'm really excited to be here with you. What a great summit this is, and a terrific spectrum of experience that the presenters have. So let's get going. The first slide that people are looking at up on their screen right now is actually something very close to my own heart, which is a picture of the Dalai Lama, and I'm standing next to him. This was taken in 2013 in Dharamsala, where the Tibetan community lives in exile, because he invited 4 Western scientists to come into dialogue with 4 Tibetan physicians, 4 Tibetan philosophers, and 4 Tibetan astrologers. It was very interesting, and he's very interested in science. As we were speaking privately, he said to me something very interesting. I'll start my talk with that. He said, well, Joan, what do you think came first, the body or the mind? And I laughed and I said, well, Your Holiness, I actually think maybe the mind came first, and then out of some larger field we grew a body. And he laughed and he said, I agree, but that makes you a terrible Western scientist. And then he laughed and he said, of course, he loves Western science, and so do I. But he said, your psychology is in kindergarten. And I found that very interesting. And I hope that what I present tonight will help bring our psychology into a larger scientific framework and perhaps a bit more of a spiritual framework as well. And on the next slide, I want to start by talking about some studies, which I'm sure many listeners are familiar with, and I'm also sure that many of our listeners have not heard of these studies. They're called the ACE studies, which is an acronym for Adverse Childhood Experiences. And as an aggregate, this group of studies, there are several of them, bridge the gap between what happens to us as children, particularly traumatic childhood experiences, and negative consequences later in life, both psychological consequences and physical consequences. And I think all of us as clinicians need to be open-minded and curious. And I want to compliment Dr. Vincent Felitti on doing just that, because at the time that he began these studies, Dr. Felitti was a physician at one of the Kaiser Permanente locations in San Diego. And he was running groups for people with obesity problems who needed, clearly to lose weight for medical reasons. And what happened was that a lot of people dropped out of the study. That in and of itself is not surprising. But what is surprising is that many of the people who were losing weight were the ones who dropped out of the study. And so, curious, he invited them in and interviewed them. And he found out what most of us are quite well aware of now, several years later, and that is it was trauma that caused them to begin overeating. One woman, for example, said, well, after I was raped by my uncle as a teenager, I gained about 100 pounds over the next couple of years. And then when this woman started to lose weight, she became very anxious and fearful because her armor was gone. And so what he says, and I think it's really so true, is that many of what we consider negative health habits are, including smoking, for example, or the taking of drugs, is a person's best effort to live as normal a life as they can. And this sometimes, of course, turns on us. Turning to our next slide, one of the things that Dr. Felitti said in his study was, how is it that we take the gold of a child and we turn it into lead? And I want to say something about the studies. He ended up collaborating with Robert Anda from the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta, Georgia. And they looked at several varieties of adverse childhood experiences. I won't go into all of them here for our purposes because people can simply Google ACE studies and you can get a free download PDFs of all of the studies from that site. And what they looked at was initially 6 and later 8 types of the adverse childhood experiences, things like physical abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, violence toward the mother, only one parent in the household, an incarcerated parent, things of that nature. And all of the adverse childhood experiences were given a numerical value of 1. So in the early studies, you could have up to 6. And I want to show you what that does in terms of physical and mental health, because, of course, the mind-body connection has been my field for 40 years. So point number 1 is that a male child with an ACE score of 6 has a 4,600% increase in probability of IV drug abuse. You don't have to be a statistician to see that that's a very significant finding. Even having an ACE score of 4 increases the probability of COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, by almost 400%. And I know personally I had some trauma in my childhood, and I smoked for many years. It took probably 1,000 times to finally give up because it calmed anxiety. And I loved his compassion. He said, this for people is their best way of coping. And it certainly was for me until I learned better ways. If you have an ACE score of 4 or more, it also raises the probability of depression by almost 500%. And an ACE score of just 4, and like I personally have an ACE score of 4, more raises the probability of suicide by over 1,200%. And this is very well known at this point. If we go to the next slide, you'll see physiologically that telomeres are shorter in children who've been abused. So what you see here is a pair of chromosomes, and the little red spots on the end are called telomeres. They're kind of like the plastic ends on a shoelace, because what they do is prevent the DNA from actually unraveling. And the shorter the telomeres, the less able a cell is to divide. And that leads to the kinds of difficulties that we're going to see on the next slide. Shortening the telomeres are necessary for cell division and renewal. And if they're shortened, what we see is an increase in both physical and psychological difficulties. So there's an increase in cancer, depression, pulmonary fibrosis, dementia, osteoarthritis, osteoporosis, and basically almost all chronic illnesses. This is work that Elizabeth Blackburn at UCSF got a Nobel Prize for. And by the way, I think everybody should know that exercise protects your telomeres. That's a great thing. And when we look at treatments for depression, exercise is also one of the best treatments for depression. I want to say a word about stress, negative emotions, and pro-inflammatory cytokines, because what affects the body also affects the mind. And I think it's very important for us as therapists to be literate in the science and what happens. So first part of our program is all about making sure that we're all up to speed on the kinds of things that are important to our mental health and the mental health of our children, of our family, of our spouses, and of our clients. So when a person is emotionally stressed, they produce too much of what's called a cytokine. That is a molecule made by the immune system, made by lymphocytes. This cytokine is called interleukin-6. whether you're physically stressed or emotionally stressed, you produce too much IL-6. That's important because, as you're going to see in a moment, IL-6 causes a problem with immunity that affects everything, the brain and the body. But if you're depressed or anxious, you also have increased IL-6 production. The interleukin-6 is called a pro-inflammatory cytokine because it creates generalized inflammation in the body and in the brain. And inflammation turns out to be really the final common pathway in practically every illness you can think of, from heart disease to diabetes, from osteoporosis to the frailty of aging. And actually, it's true in most cancers as well. And I want to say now, I want to try to connect, and we'll do more connection, of the body, the brain, what goes on in terms of exercise, diet, all of the things that come together now in understanding psychological factors in a more sophisticated way. So we know that chronic stress, on the next slide here, is a trigger for diverse psychiatric disorders, depression included. And we know, and you also, I'm sure, heard quite a bit of this in Stephen Porges and other talks, chronic stress dysregulates the hypothalamic pituitary axis and also affects the vagus nerve. But also what happens is you need BDNF, which is a brain-derived neurotropic factor, to help regulate that stress HPA axis. We know now for sure in animal studies that if you expose, for example, a rat to mild chronic stress for just 4 weeks, they lose their resilience. And we need brain-derived neurotropic factor in order to be resilient. And of course, one of the questions I had going to Tibet and being able to talk with Tibetan scientists and philosophers at that meeting in Dharamsala, I was interested in resilience. Another one of the Western scientists who I actually suggested that they bring over was a very, very good friend of mine who runs the Center for Mind-Body Medicine in Washington, D.C., and that's Jim Gordon. And Jim specializes in working with survivors of torture and genocide all over the world. And of course, there was genocide in Tibet, which is why the Tibetan government in exile is now in India. And it was very, very interesting to me to go with Jim to a center for torture survivors in Dharamsala and ask people what created resilience for them. And it was really very touching. The only 2 people out of 15 felt that they had really made some progress in the PTSD from being in a genocide situation and then in a prison camp situation. One was a young woman who had gone to Rishikesh in India and studied yoga for a year. And she said there was something about the practice of yoga that seemed to have changed her nervous system and her outlook. The second was a Tibetan Buddhist monk. And he said he thinks it was his practice of mindfulness and his general view of a place in the universe that helped him. And if we could measure their BDNF, one of the things we would probably see is that it was increased over that of the other trauma survivors who hadn't yet located their resilience. As we'll see a little bit later in the talk too, not only do things like yoga and mindfulness and narrative medicine, changing your meaning, make a difference, but you can also see differences in activity in the left prefrontal cortex with people who are resilient. So more on that to come. What does brain-derived neurotrophic factor respond to? And this is something that I think we need to take into account when we're trying to help people find their strength and develop resilience. It turns out it's increased quite a bit by diet, by what we eat. And oftentimes, when people are traumatized, they don't eat well. You know, they tend to go for refined carbs, comfort foods that are not great. And it turns out that one of the most important aspects of diet is that it can relieve anxiety and depression, not only through BDNF, but as I'll explain more in a moment, by changing the type of bacteria one has in one's gut. Because your gut bacteria are very important in terms of producing the lion's share of your neurotransmitters. What we know now is that really a Mediterranean diet, a diet that is rich in nuts, in lots of vegetables, in fish, in colored fruits, you know, all those phytochemicals that are plant pigments, and that increases BDNF. It's also increased by curcumin, which is found in turmeric. Interestingly enough, that's a major ingredient in curry. I love curry. But one of the findings is that in village India, where people prepare curry for every meal, and they're taking that curcumin and they saute it up in oil, and that really releases some of the compounds that are important, that little black pepper. This is responsible for the fact that there is almost no Alzheimer's disease in village India, that the brain is affected, its ability to rewire itself is affected, the ability of people to be resistant to stress is affected by diet. Omega-3 fatty acids, DHA, increases BDNF, and there are several ongoing studies now through the National Institute of Health that are extending the work already on the consumption of omega-3s and the relief of depression. A couple of grams of omega-3s have been found in several studies to be very effective in terms of an antidepressant. The other thing about omega-3s, there's a study that's ongoing now to see whether a couple of grams, I mean, that's a really normal amount. I take a couple of grams of omega-3s every day to see whether this amount of omega-3s can help with suicide prevention in troops that are returning from war zones. So what we eat affects a lot more than our weight. It affects our brain, our ability of the brain to regenerate. Walnuts and avocados really increase BDNF. In general, a low-carb diet. And that may be because complex carbs, what we find in fruits and vegetables, are really good for us. But refined carbs that cause spikes in blood sugar are injurious to the body. This is not a lecture on the Plant Plus diet, but there's so much interesting evidence. Now, here is a wonderful finding. Coffee actually increases BDNF. I love coffee, so I'm happy. Fasting and calorie restriction increase BDNF, but personally, I'd rather drink coffee. So what decreases BDNF? Let's take a look at the next slide. So the first thing you'll see is diets that are high in saturated fat will decrease BDNF. All the refined carbs, sugar, flour, and a sedentary lifestyle. And it's no wonder then that our standard American diet, which is so carb-rich, creates depression and also anxiety. that plus being plugged in and having a lack of face-to-face connection, which is so important. Relationship is so important for resilience and for the correct informational molecules to be released by the brain that keeps us in harmony. Because, as the slide says, though we may network electronically, social support is critical for both the immune system and the nervous system. Okay, I want to talk to you a little bit now about epigenetics. Years ago, people used to say to me, oh my goodness, I've got a problem that's related to cellular memory, and I'm a pretty hard scientist, and I would say there's no evidence for cellular memory. But you know what? There is, and it's a new field called epigenetics. This picture that you see on this next slide on epigenetics turns out to have been sent to me about 6 years ago by a family member I'd never met. And what you see here is my own family. This was my great uncle and his family. They all perished in Auschwitz. And I asked myself, before I knew about this, why it was that some people seemed to have a lot. They looked like trauma survivors, but they didn't seem to have any trauma in their background. And I thought, well, maybe they've repressed it. But in fact, one of the most interesting things is we now know that trauma is heritable for up to 4 generations. And I look at my own family, and although my branch of the family, thank God, was not in Europe at the time of the Holocaust, nonetheless, my grandparents came here because they were escaping from pogroms. And my whole lineage was stressed in that way. Now here's a piece of, on the next slide, a little piece of understanding about the new field of epigenetics. So let me try to explain this in a nutshell because it's important. As you read the psychological literature these days, you probably notice that a lot of it has to do with epigenetics. You look at some of the new studies on meditation, they tell you what genes are silenced, what genes are repressed. They talk about single nucleotide polymorphisms, and it's important for us as therapists to at least know what this is all about. So what's epigenetics? The human genome is really pretty constant. It changes really slowly over millions of years, which is a terrific thing. That means the baby born today looks like a baby born 10,000 years ago. Doesn't look like a lizard or a hippopotamus. But on the other hand, the environment around us changes all the time. And the science of epigenetics is what explains how our genes can adapt to changes in the environment. Even though the actual structure of the genome, the genes themselves don't change. So this is a quick course on the next slide of what's actually happening. So if you read an article, you'll be able to at least get an understanding of what it's talking about. On the upper left-hand part of the slide, you see a chromosome. And that chromosome has about 6 feet of DNA. Well, actually, all the chromosomes together have about 6 feet in length of DNA in the nucleus of every one of your teeny-weeny little cells. And you'd think, how could there be that much DNA? Why isn't it a tangled mess? And it's not a tangled mess because if you follow it around, you can see in the middle of the slide that it's wound on little spools. And the spools are octamers. An octamer means 8. An 8-molecule octamer called a histone protein. And that's like a spool in which the thread of DNA winds around. Now, if the DNA is coiled tight around the histones, then it's not available to be transcribed into proteins, and the gene is silent. The DNA is inaccessible. the gene is inactive. But if you look to the slide on the bottom right, when certain molecules bind to like little tails on the histone protein, either it pulls them tight and silences the gene, or it opens them up. The spool unwinds a little bit, and the DNA becomes accessible for transcription. So let me tell you a tiny bit more about that over the next two slides. So next slide, please. Methylation is the off switch that causes the thread of DNA to tighten on the histone spool. And as I already said, tightly coiled DNA silences genes. Methyl molecules, if you remember your high school chemistry, it's a carbon and 3 hydrogens attached to those histone proteins and block access. And each methylation is called a mark or a tag. On the next slide, you'll see that acetylation is the on switch when an acetyl molecule, a carbon and oxygen, and then a CH3 molecule, connect to the DNA. The spool allows the DNA to loosen and exposes genes for transcription. So the sum total of these methyl and acetyl groups, called marks or tags, control your gene activity. The word epigenetics itself technically means above the genes, and that's what the marks represent. They're a control panel, and the control panel is called the epigenome. So now, in science, we're seeing 3 different genomes: the genes that come from mom and dad, the epigenome, and also the microbial genome, which I'll say a few words about in a minute. Now, here is the interesting part. Normally, like when cells, eggs and sperm form, when there's what's called gametogenesis, all the tags disappear so that they're not inherited by the offspring. But in the case of trauma, the tags are not only inherited by the offspring, but by the offspring's offspring, up to 4 generations. And we've known that in terms of animal studies for several years. But the very first human study of intergenerational trauma was just published in August, like 5 weeks ago. And I've put for you on the next slide here the actual citation so that you can look it up. And it was a study of Holocaust exposure. And here's the kind of punchline of the study, that when Holocaust survivors and their children were studied, they had identical epigenetic tags in a region of a gene that was associated with control of stress hormones. And of course, the people who did the study wanted to check and see that the tags were not associated with direct trauma to the offspring, but were inherited. And they were able to show that through their analyses. And so it's a rather chilling thing to think that it's almost biblical to quote sins of the parents or the traumas of the parents go for 4 generations into the future, which means that as a culture, almost everybody has got some history of trauma. And that's why it's so important to learn about BDNF and learn about the gut-brain axis so that we can feed our children, feed our troops, feed ourselves in a way that allows some of this very basic resilience to develop in the brain. I want to say just a word now about loneliness, because this is important too. We all know that loneliness exacerbates stress, and if somebody has a history of trauma, they're likely to isolate anyhow, and that causes tremendous problems because pro-inflammatory genes get overexpressed anti-inflammatory genes get underexpressed. And there's a wonderful researcher, Lisa Jaremko. You can see her study on the next slide here. And she looked at herpes virus antibody titers. And she could see that when people are lonely, that's when a virus will replicate because we lose immune control over it. So it's so important. And I want to say that all of you who are therapists are so important. You are the energy. You're the pair of eyes and ears. You're the good heart that looks upon your clients with an unconditional positive regard that actually all alone changes their brain and their life. So I love you all. Okay, so I wanted to take a brief look at epigenetics and PTSD before we get into, well, more of what we can do to alleviate these problems. So here's the next slide. And the question I ask here is, who is most susceptible to PTSD? Epigenetics gives us a little extra window on that. What we know is that the risk of developing PTSD increases with the number of traumatic events that a person is exposed to. But if you, I've given you a research article here by Kanan et al. In Depression and Anxiety, the journal, that methylation of a particular gene, a serotonin transporter gene, turns out to modify how the number of traumatic events in a person's life affects their risk for PTSD. Turns out that the higher the levels of methylation, the more protection a person has against PTSD. The lower levels of methylation are associated with increased risk for PTSD after exposure to multiple traumatic events. So what you're going to see in a little while is what we eat can have a tremendous effect on that. But first, in the next slide, I wanted to just say a few words about epigenetics and addiction, because it's becoming more and more important in our understanding of mental health. This, once again, you have on the slide, you've got the study that I'm citing, and it was a study by Mays et al., who said that repeated exposure, they wrote, to numerous drugs of abuse alters gene expression profiles throughout the reward circuitry of the brain. Recent data suggests that repeated exposure to the psychostimulant cocaine promotes alterations in histone acetylation, phosphorylation, and methylation levels in the nucleus accumbens. These modifications may be involved in mediating drug-induced behaviors. So we're beginning to see some very interesting common pathways. I wrote a book, came out last year at about this time, called The Plant Plus Diet Solution, Personalized Nutrition for Life. I wrote it because of the kinds of things that I've been telling you. I wish I had more time to really talk about this, because I want to say one thing about our cells and our microbes. This is the most surprising research of the last 10 years. And think about it. In this last 10 years, we've mapped the human genome. The epigenome was discovered and almost mapped. And it was discovered we have a third genome, that 99% of our genetic material is not mammalian, because we are mostly microbial. This is the big deal, that we're a composite ecosystem, that the human body has about 10 trillion mammalian cells, but 100 trillion microbial cells that instruct the immune system and also help to instruct the brain. And those microbes are very related, of course, to what we eat. And if you don't have good gut microbes, and you have 3 to 4 pounds of them, it's like a second brain in your tummy. If you don't eat enough fiber, then you starve out some of those gut bacteria. And that's very, very, very important. When we think of beneficial bacteria as probiotics, we have our own probiotics in our gut. And we have to feed them prebiotics, which is largely fiber. And if you look at the cover on the slide I've got here of my book, The Plant Plus Diet Solution, it looks like a bag of vegetables. And the idea is, in order to be really healthy, in order to make the right neurotransmitters, because your gut bacteria have a number of ecosystem functions. They keep your gut lining intact, which is important, because if it's not intact, you leak things called endotoxins into the bloodstream, and you can also develop autoimmunity because of that. But it affects the brain and nervous system in a very, very powerful way, because of the fact that most of your neurotransmitters are not made in the brain. They're made in the gut by your gut bacteria. And so this is really fascinating. And you don't have to be a vegan. In fact, it took me 3 years to research this book, because the field of nutrition is ultimately confusing. And of all the fields of science, it has the poorest studies I've ever seen. I was horrified. Most of them are retrospective, absolutely not meant to be trusted, not at all statistically decent. Anyhow, 3 years of reviewing the literature, I realized the basis of a good diet that we need to recommend to all of our clients is a pound of vegetables and some fruits every day, to get rid of the junk food as much as possible, to eliminate processed food and to eliminate refined carbs, and to eat organic when possible, because pesticides are a powerful epigenetic modulator. And at least in mice, they're passed from generation to generation. The study hasn't yet been done in humans, but I bet that's going to be the truth. So we need to counteract the fact that most of our children have epigenetic tags for trauma by the mother and the father eating a decent diet before they get pregnant, and then feeding their child a decent diet. And beyond that, it's new, because you have 3 genomes, different people thrive on different things. Some people can thrive as vegans, and those are the ones who can eat more complex carbs and grains. Other people sicken as vegans. Some people really need to eat meat, like His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, when he was asked, but you practice ahimsa, nonviolence, why do you eat meat? He says, well, I live in a place where vegetables have not traditionally grown at high altitudes, and I have to eat meat to live. So we're all different that way. But this is, I would say, what goes on with our gut bacteria and what goes on with our epigenome is such a big part of our mental health that we must address it. Sometimes I consult to addiction treatment centers, and people are just eating garbage over there, and that's not what the recovering brain needs at all. So let's talk for a while about what do we need other than changing our diet. How can we change our point of view? So the next slide really starts our practicum. And I want to talk about our narrative and how that affects the brain and behavior. So next slide, please. We all know that the brain changes. And those of you who listened to Rick Hansen's section had a terrific update on how that happens and how the brain rewires itself. But I want to talk about something a little bit different from what discuss. And I'm going to quote the work of psychologist Jack Kornfield, who was one of the original people who introduced mindfulness to the field of psychology. When I was I ran a mind-body clinic at one of the Harvard teaching hospitals, along with Herb Benson, who he was the first person to bring meditation into medicine, to the discoverer of what was called the relaxation response, the body's opposite of the fight or flight response. Like when you stop thinking and you just attend to a repetitive stimulus, whether it's your breath or whether it's a mantra or a prayer or whatever, you get specific changes that are now, by the way, being tracked down at the epigenetic level. But anyhow, Jack Kornfield was practicing at Cambridge City Hospital in Boston, and he came over to give us a journal club. And I've been fascinated with him and his work since. And that was, oh my goodness, in probably when might he have come over? 1983, something like that, many, many years ago. But I was actually fascinated by a more recent lecture that I heard Jack give. And first he established a context from a Time magazine article. And the article, which you can see on the slide in front of you, said this: after more than a century of looking for it, brain researchers have long since concluded that there's no conceivable place for a self to be located in the physical brain. And here was Jack's commentary on this. He said, self is quite malleable. There is no fixed self, but we're constantly creating self with the stories we tell, the beliefs we have, and what we choose to identify with. And that's so true. Well, let's go a little bit more into this. And this kind of slide, you're probably, many of you, familiar with, because it's just a sagittal section through the brain. That means that it splits the brain into two halves, right and the left. And what you can see here is the medial prefrontal cortex in purple, the ventromedial, ventral means bottom, median means middle. So the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, and then the amygdala and some of the circuitry here. So what goes on in our midbrain is that it's instinctual. It's so great that we have instincts, and we don't have to tell ourselves we should run from a tiger. It just happens. It also is the pleasure-seeking apparatus. We're wired for pleasure. If something feels good or tastes good, whether it's like procreation or food, we're wired to do it. We're wired to avoid fear. And the midbrain, therefore, doesn't reflect on things, it just reacts. And these are all of our circuits for survival. And you all know at this point, if you've been listening to the lectures in this wonderful summit so far, that in trauma, the midbrain is so highly activated. And the prefrontal cortex, on the other hand, is where we have our sense of self developing. It thinks. It's goal-oriented and reflective. It asks questions. Does this choice help me realize my long-term goals and plans? It's the interface between what goes on in the environment and what goes on in our emotional life inside of us. So it's our emotional regulator. And I think the sight of a therapist, we ourselves sometimes act as the prefrontal cortex of a frightened, traumatized client and hold that space for them until they can hold it themselves. And you'll see that on the next slide. My thought that we do provide an external prefrontal cortex while the client develops their own. This slide is a quote from Sharon Zegley, who is a tremendous science writer and a tremendous, really, source of expertise in neuroscience. Sharon, this was from a lecture that she gave, in fact, I was a commentator on. Sharon said the amygdala is the region that sends out signals: be afraid, be depressed, be on your toes for signs of danger. And when those signals are going full blast, it's very hard to be resilient. So the prefrontal cortex basically says to the amygdala, quiet down. And when it's able to do so, people are able to be resilient. The activation of the left prefrontal cortex in a resilient person can be 30 times that of someone who isn't resilient. So things like exercise, eating the way that I talked about, having a therapist who holds the space for you, practicing mindfulness, and as we'll see in a minute, changing your narrative so that your sense of self is no longer small and frightened, but that it's much more grand and noble. These are the things that can help the brain be able to be more rewired. Some of you may have read some of the work of the late John O'Donohue. I have to say that he was a wonderful Irish poet and wise man. He wrote a beautiful book on beauty, but my favorite book that he wrote is Anam Cara, which is Gaelic for soul friend. And I do think that one of the jobs of a therapist is to be a soul friend to a client. We might not put it in those words, but what we're doing is seeing the light, seeing the best in someone. And through our eyes and through our the whole way that we interact with the client, we become a field of healing. John O'Donohue wrote this, and I hope that's the slide that's up. And I think about it as helping a client to discover an identity that's way more enduring than a diagnosis. He wrote, your identity is not equivalent to your biography. There's a place in you where you have never been wounded, where there is a seamlessness in you, where there is a confidence and tranquility in you. And I think the intention of prayer and spirituality and love is now again to visit that kind of inner sanctuary. And of course, that's what any kind of meditation or mindfulness or yoga or walking in nature or music, all of these things are so important to people. It's really important, I think, for us and for our clients to spend time unplugged, spend time in those things that bring forth the inherent unwounded part of us, which is there. And the more that comes out, the more resilient a person is going to be. So we're kind of talking a little bit here about spirituality. And on the next slide, you see a Men's Sana monograph by Harvard psychiatrist George Valiant, whose work on adaptation to life and on addiction has really been inspiring for many years. The monograph is called Positive Emotions, Spirituality, and the Practice of Psychiatry. So in this monograph, Dr. Valiant talks about 8 positive emotions: awe and love, and Diana's been talking about attachment. We can't really feel the sense of love without attachment. Another positive emotion is trust, and that has to do with faith, perhaps, in life, and we all might interpret that in a different way. He also talks about compassion, gratitude, forgiveness, joy, and hope, saying that these 8 positive emotions constitute what we mean by spirituality. And this is all from the introduction to his article. He goes on and he says, these emotions have been grossly ignored by psychiatry. spirituality is not about ideas, sacred texts, and theology. Rather, spirituality is all about emotion and social connection. Our whole concept of psychotherapy might change if clinicians set about enhancing positive emotions rather than focusing only on negative emotions. I could not agree more with that. I think it's so very, very important. On the next slide, I'm going to quote my friend and colleague of many years, Rachel Naomi Brennan. She wrote books like Kitchen Table Wisdom and My Grandfather's Blessing. These are healing stories. And Rachel wrote, "The spiritual is that realm of human experience which religion attempts to connect us to through dogma and practice. Sometimes it succeeds and sometimes it fails. Religion is a bridge to the spiritual, but the spiritual lies beyond religion. Unfortunately, in seeking the spiritual, we may become attached to the bridge rather than crossing over it." I talk to you about these things because I think one of the biggest things missing in training as psychologists is training us in the spiritual, because people associate it with religion. And as Rachel said, yes, I mean, it can be through religion, but spirituality is beyond religion, and we neglect it at our peril. The last bit I want to talk to you about before we get on to our time of Q&A is about the new field of narrative medicine. It's interesting that there's now a master's degree for healthcare providers at Columbia University in narrative medicine, because our story is everything. And certainly in the diagnostic encounter, we hear narratives all the time. And on this slide called Narrative Medicine, you see a person's story. What is that? Well, it's the whole medium of their experience of life. It's your story as the filter through which you see everything. When you hear a narrative, it can encourage empathy and promote understanding, because a lot of the role of the therapist is to be a safe space that allows our client to make new meaning, to encourage reflection, to provide an enlarged framework for understanding what brought them in, understanding their trauma, their addiction, their illness, and the process of healing itself. Dan Siegel says this, if we go to the next slide. He said narrative medicine is creating a larger context for your story that lets you find the nobility within yourself and share it. I've titled this slide from a quote by Carolyn Mace, who said years ago, "Your biography becomes your biology."
Well,
that's so
okay,
true.
Sorry.
I agree
Just that the
wholeheartedly with
cartridges are a
that.
totally different sort. And
But the good thing
if you're feeling a bit disorganised, it was quite hard to pen and bang, there goes all your
narrative.
cartridges.
I
And
think
you have
it's
to
one
do
of the
anything.
most important parts of therapy. So on the next slide, it's entitled "In Praise of Healing Fiction." And I want to credit the Jungian analyst James Hellman with the word healing fiction. And what I say about it is this: the stories we tell ourselves that make sense of the world are not necessarily true. It doesn't matter, true or not, they make a positive difference in how we live our lives. So I want to harken back to what I was saying about visiting the center in Dharamsala for survivors of torture, that the Tibetan Buddhist monk thought, well, it's his view of life, his whole narrative, what is the meaning of life, that was such an important part, along with the meditations, self-regulation strategies, that allowed him to overcome some of his trauma. Probably the greatest expert on resilience was Viktor Frankl. His book, Man's Search for Meaning, is truly a classic. And he gave us all hope. The reason why he survived 4 different death camps and made it out of there was because of a strong belief he had that he was meant to survive so that he could teach other people to be resilient. And he has. My God, how he fulfilled that destiny. I love this quote of his: "What is to give light must endure burning." And I think, for me, the narrative of the hero's journey is so important for people who are ill or traumatized, that they're not the first one to live through this story. The first part of the hero's journey, the initiatory rite, is for your life to fall away, for the ground underneath you to open up so that you're floating formless in the place between no longer and not yet, in liminal space. And that's both a sacred space and a scary space. It's sacred because you lose your identity. And if you've got a good therapist who's a good mentor, who can hold your hand through that time of uncertainty and allow you to make meaning of your story, then you get to the third part of the hero's journey scenario, which is to give life to others, to re-enter life with the wisdom that only somebody whose heart has been so desperately broken can possibly give. So when I see that quote, "What is to give life must endure burning," that's what I mean. So Frankl, the lovely quote of his, said this: "For the first time in my life, I saw the truth, as it's set into song by so many poets, proclaimed as the final wisdom by so many thinkers. The truth, that love is the ultimate and highest goal to which man can aspire. Then I grasped the meaning of the greatest secret that human poetry and human thought and belief have to impart. The salvation of man is through love and in love." That made a big impression on me. It made a big impression, too, on Martin Seligman, who was really a student of Viktor Frankl and also brought forth the field of positive psychology that Viktor Frankl started. Frankl, by the way, was also, in my mind, the father of the field of psychoneuroimmunology. He knew what happened when people gave up hope. They died of rapid cardiac death, or they'd pick up the next disease that went through camp because their immune system was so compromised. And I'd only like to spend maybe another 5 minutes and then open it up for questions. So I'm going to go through the next slides really quickly. But Martin Seligman talked about attribution theory and coping. Attribution theory, to what do you attribute a negative event? In other words, what's the story you tell yourself? And people who are not resilient, who are prone to pessimism and helplessness, have an attribution of what he calls helpfully the 3 Ps. They believe whatever happened, they take it personally. It's their own fault. And you can follow along on the slide here, shift in perspective. They think whatever happens is their own fault. I've met so many people, for example, who were traumatized. I ran an AIDS clinic in the very beginning of the epidemic, where really AIDS was a death sentence and a pretty immediate one. And the first place that the majority of my clients went is, "Oh my God, my church was right. What I'm doing is wrong in the eyes of God and I'm being punished." And what I found is that people who had that kind of personal story and blamed themselves died first, because you can see that it relates to the immune system, to really all the systems of the body. But helpless people blame themselves, they take it personally. They think pervasively. It's not just whatever is gone wrong that's their fault. No, they say, "I mess up everything I do, and it's kind of permanent. It's the story of my life." That's the story they tell themselves. If you know at all the literature on stress hardiness, at around the same time that Seligman was writing about this, a very wonderful psychologist, Suzanne Willette Kobasa, was writing about stress hardiness. And she said people who are hardy in the face of stress have a very different attributional theory. And she said they think in terms of the 3 C's. Instead of seeing their problem so much as a threat, they see it as a challenge. It's something to overcome. Instead of trying to control everything in their life, they focus on just controlling what's really relevant. And instead of checking out, they stay engaged. That's what commitment is, commitment to the process. And the kind of catchword of stress hardiness is stressful events challenge me to change and grow. You can see these are 2 diametrically opposed narratives. It was very interesting. I became aware of the work of neuroscientist Evan Alexander, who wrote that book, Proof of Heaven, when he had a near-death experience. And as he writes in his book, he said, look, this isn't experimental data on an N of 1. But he had a transcendent experience that changed his narrative about life, and everything changed because of that. I'm going to actually skip over the next several slides. I'm going to go through them now. You can watch and hopefully absorb them. I'm so fascinated by this that I always end up putting in more slides than I can go through. But what we're really seeing is that love is the heart of healing. Tender, loving care reduces interleukin-6. It reduces cortisol levels. It increases levels of human growth hormone. And this is just a part of how loving support induces and sustains the self-healing mechanisms of the body. There's a slide here called Love and Health. I'll just give you a couple of fast bullet points. Love is an antagonist to stress. It stimulates the pleasure system. And all these informational molecules that you see in your slide, from endorphins to dopamine to vasopressin to nitric oxide, increase health. It decreases anxiety and depression, enhances motivation and positive choice, increases well-being, and decreases physical symptoms. This is the last bit that I want to give you before we have our Q&A now. You'll see on the next slide, this is a study of forgiveness after emotional abuse. This is the punchline, and then you'll see shortly who did the study and its relevance to narrative medicine. Emotionally abused women often have PTSD and affective disorders after the abusive relationship ends. This was a little study. They took 20 women who had left their abusers at least a year before, and they were assigned either to forgiveness training or an alternative training in anger validation, assertiveness, and interpersonal skill building. And I was amazed at the findings, which you'll see on the next slide. Results. Women in the forgiveness intervention, first of all, let me tell you what it was. The forgiveness intervention was changing one's story, because frequently people, they tell themselves the same story over and over and over again, and they re-traumatize themselves over and over and over again. So these women, instead of telling themselves again about that low-down dirty dog who emotionally abused them or beat them or did whatever terrible thing had happened, instead of that, they were told to write a story about benefit finding, about being the heroine of their own story, about the strengths that they found in themselves that allowed them to leave an abusive relationship, which is not always an easy thing to do. I know some very powerful women who took a long time to get out of such a relationship, but it was all about changing stories. That's what forgiveness is. So women in the forgiveness intervention had significantly greater improvement in depression, trait anxiety, symptoms of PTSD, self-esteem, forgiveness, environmental mastery, and finding meaning in suffering. And so I think we better stop at this point, Diane. The other studies talk a little bit about how important mindfulness is in terms of allowing emotions and perceptions without judging them and letting go of resistance to what is. And I'll just end with this slide on the heart of mindfulness. The wonderful late Basque anthropologist and psychologist Angela Arian used to talk about 4 rules for life. She said we have to show up and not escape from reality, to show up and to be present, to pay attention to what is, to say what's real for us, and not to be attached to the results. And as therapists, this is what we do. And I guess I'll go one more slide. Here's the last slide. This is my sweet husband, Gordon, who Diane knows. And this is one of our 2 big poodles. This is Milo the Magnificent. When all else fails, consult your local pet therapist. Because it turns out that pets, because they're unconditional loving, here's one more slide, are good for our mind, they're good for our moods and emotions, and they're even good for our hearts. If you've had a heart attack, get a dog. They just decrease the risk that you'll die in the next year. And petting or playing with a dog blisses us out, lowers our blood pressure, heart rate, and makes good hormones. So I think that's enough for tonight. And Diane, that's what I have to say, and I want to thank you for the opportunity of saying it.
Oh, Joan, that was a wonderful, rich experience, and everything from epigenetics and intergenerational trauma and gut microbes and nutrition and exercise, how to build our body, brain, and spirit for more resilience, and narrative medicine, and finally the significance of love and really looking at the value of having a dog. I love it. It was beautiful. So I want to, yeah, really great. I want to celebrate that with you. It's really beautiful. And the research to support it, and so many great references for all of our therapists to read more about, from everybody from George Valiant to so many people you quoted. So let's jump into some of the questions that folks have been holding on to. Lots of people want to talk to you. So I'm going to just go down the list here. Bob asks you, Joan, if you had only one technique or exercise to offer a client that's experiencing chronic stress and fatigue, what might that be?
Oh, that's a great question. See, only one is like taking a Shakespearean play and saying what's most important: the costume, the actors, the script, the lighting. Because outcome of interpersonal relation and therapy is an emergent phenomena that comes from an interaction of many factors. So it would be really hard for me to answer that question, and it would depend on the client, totally depend on who the client is. So that's the best I can do. It would be different for different clients.
And you've mentioned several things.
Yeah, go ahead, Diane.
You've mentioned several things in this talk that could really help someone with those symptoms.
Oh, well, absolutely. It might be mindfulness for someone. That might be the most important thing. It might be changing the story to combine narrative medicine and mindfulness. It's a very powerful technique. And for some people, taking a 15-minute walk every day and getting out in nature, that alone is going to make a tremendous change.
With their dog.
With your dog, absolutely. And some of the research shows that virtually all of these things, by the way, stimulate development of the left prefrontal cortex where resilience is. That's true of exercise. It's true of cognitive therapy. It's true of any kind of meditation, not just mindfulness. And it's true of food. And I don't know if the research has been done yet, but I think it's also true of music. So there are a lot of a lot of interventions to choose from.
There's another question here from Mark. What has science discovered about guided imagery and how it helps a person recover from stress, anxiety, depression, and what would be some simple strategies that we can offer clients who may not necessarily be drawn to more formal types of meditation and spirituality?
That's a great question. And of course, I would recommend to go to the website of Health Journeys, and that is the website of a colleague, Belruth Naperstek, Naperstek, Belruth Naperstek. And if you, by the way, get her newsletter, every newsletter has got a new piece of research in it about guided imagery. But essentially, what is guided imagery other than changing perspective? It's a way of changing story. Guided imagery is very akin to hypnosis because the first phase is you put a person in trance, and then you lead them to look at their story in a new light. And we know there's research on guided imagery, both in terms of outcome, people being less depressed or anxious. So right now, Belruth is very interested in using it for our returning warriors with PTSD. And then, of course, if you look at stress hormones, you're going to see a difference. I don't know if there are, I'm sure there must be epigenetic studies of guided imagery, but I haven't looked at that literature in a while. So go to Belruth's Health Journeys website.
She has great resources there, I know. And Rochelle, I'm linking a question here from Rochelle. She says, with regard to epigenetics and inherited trauma stress tags, do we know if they are more likely to be passed on through the mother or sort of equal with mom and dad?
I don't know if that research has been done, so I can't answer that question. But I can tell you that, and that's a very good question, by the way. In rat studies, anyhow, it doesn't matter. It could be handed on through either the mother or the father. In terms of human studies, this is the first one that's come out, so don't know for sure.
Okay. Thank you. And Lori has a nice question about attachment. She says, what is the most important factor in helping a client overcome an adverse early environment and to repair insecure attachment? And what has neuroscience shared with us about how this transformation might take place?
Well, I would say, Diane, that you're the expert on that, and I'd like to hear you answer that question so I can learn something tonight.
Well, I think we're really lucky in our field today that there's that attachment theory's been around for a while, but it's kind of resurfacing in terms of how we really use it in our practice. And I think therapists play a major role in having done some of their own work. I mean, a lot of us have our own personal journey that we've been working hard on, but where we can presence more of a safe environment. Stephen Porges talked a lot last night about the importance of safety and how we can cue with our voice and our gaze and our different ways we interact with clients, unconditional positive regard, that really helps them start to get the reflection from more of a secure base, whether it's in their marriage or whether it's in the office with us as therapists. And that repeated exposure really helps bring people towards secure attachment, as well as I really feel corrective experiences, like actually helping people, kind of leans into Rick Hansen's talk, actually have more positive experiences, even if we're creating a fantasy corrective experience in the session that they can relate to. Like, what difference would it make if you had a protector in your childhood versus, suffering the injury of not being protected? So I have a lot to say about that, and I think it's not a simple question. There's a lot to it, and I'll be exploring it a lot in my talk on, I think it's Sunday. So
that's important.
Gottman's research, if we go to research, he says
it's
learning.
Good. And, Diane, that's where pets come into it, too, because before people are safe, pets are safe.
Right.
They have unconditional positive regard. It's a bad day if you come in and your dog bites you. They love you.
Right.
That's the nature. That's the nature of it. And I also want to relate this to the earlier question on guided imagery, because For many years, I've done guided imagery with clients, which is kind of a corrective emotional experience to see themselves as a child, to comfort that child, to touch the child into their heart. That's where guided imagery or hypnosis, or I think they're really, as I said, very akin to one another, can really come in handy. And you mentioned the other important things. I don't think we can be very helpful to other people before we've done our own work. That the confidence, the security, our own inner goodness that radiates through us, our own ability to be settled in ourselves, who knows? I think it actually probably causes us to exude different pheromones that affect the brain directly. But it affects, Stephen Porges talks about the safe face. It affects your vagus. When you're seeing somebody's face and it's responding to you in such a present, loving way. And so doing our own work, that's very, very important. It's critical. Without it, we really can't be that safe space for somebody else.
And it gives us so many gifts to share. Rachel's Naomi Remen also had a quote that something like this, that the more we keep revisiting our wounds and, they come back and back again in different ways, they eventually become indistinguishable from our wisdom. And I love that perspective, that we're actually, as we're healing, we're really becoming larger, and then we have more to share and can hold more for our clients as well as be it ourselves.
Well, that's right, because we come back when we ourselves complete that piece of our hero's journey, that third phase of the hero's journey that is called the return, is that we return with wisdom to share with others, and it's a progressively self-generating upward spiral, and that's the good thing.
There's a question here from Lynn also about many of our clients are entering in the midst of menopause and struggling with low energy and depression. What approaches or methodologies have you found most supportive to women dealing with menopause?
First of all, women dealing with menopause need to know that the changes they're experiencing, for the most part, are likely to be temporary. And I love to create a story around them, which I think is very true. Your whole body is changing, and it's a very, very positive change. Your brain is changing during menopause, and in fact, for the whole rest of a woman's lifetime. You're getting progressively more right brain dominance. Intuition, pattern recognition is all increasing. And when people start saying, oh, I have foggy brain, I can't remember anything, what I tell them is it's part of the development of wisdom. You may not be able to see every tree clearly, but you can see the forest. And to recognize this is a new phase of life. And instead of telling yourself a story that you're dried up, used up, not sexy anymore, nobody wants you, et cetera, which is a common story women tell themselves. Instead, to recognize that it's a rite of passage into the time of wisdom. And that makes all the difference, because the story that you tell yourself affects your physiology. One more thing about that. When I have women who really are having a lot of trouble with hot flashes, I like to reframe the hot flashes. So here's the particular reframe, which is based on a piece of scientific research that Herb Benson and his Harvard collaborators did years ago. There is, in Tibetan Buddhism, a form of meditation called Tumo Yoga, G-T-U-M-O. In Tibetan, Tumo means fierce woman. And on a special night, the full moon in February, the Tibetan New Year, the monks traditionally would do a practice that is still done by monks today. And that is they wrap themselves in wet sheets and they raise the tumo, the fierce woman energy, actually up the energy body, up the chakras, and they liberate so much heat that they dry their sheets. And I'd actually read about that in a book, told Dr. Benson about it, and as it happened, the Dalai Lama was coming to Harvard shortly thereafter and gave Benson permission to study the Tumo Yoga and the monks. And sure enough, they could raise their body temperature several degrees Fahrenheit without changing their core temperature. They liberated these huge amounts of heat. And this was, fantastic in early meditation research. This was like, wow, way beyond the relaxation response, more akin to some hypnotic effect maybe, but very specific. And then I remember having my first hot flash and thinking to myself, those monks have to practice all of their lives to do what's natural for a woman at menopause. And so I instructed myself to, when the hot flash came, I would imagine bringing that energy up my energy body and burning away old habits, old thoughts, old beliefs, and opening myself up in a new way to wisdom. And I cannot tell you how many menopausal women have found that reframe, which is what a new story is, incredibly positive, because suddenly you think, oh my God, this is fantastic. I'm like a monk. I'm burning away the old stuff. It's fabulous, entering the world of wisdom.
Thank you. Throw it into the fire, right? So